Okay, thank you everybody for attending. Best practices for modernizing and securing your directories. I'm Nathan Mertz, Senior Architect for Oxford Computer Group. I'm not sure if everybody knows who Oxford is. We're an identity-driven security company. We deliver long-term value-added services for identity, identity governance, and data protection. We have about over 19 years of track record deploying identity and hybrid identity solutions. We've delivered over 900 projects across the world. We've been Partner of the Year 8 times. In 2020, we were a finalist for Microsoft Security System Integrator of the Year, and we have a very close connection with the Microsoft Cloud Engineering team. Some of the services that we provide security assessments, workshops, readiness assessments, security reviews, and we do have OCG training for MIM and software IDM. So our deployment services are Azure Active Directory, M365, Office 365 integration, migration. Our identity and access management solutions are MIM, Savient, software IDM. And then our managed services, we have a help desk support. We can do 24/7 monitoring, alerting, and logging, maintenance, and any third-party application management, and we do provide training courses also. A little bit about myself. I'm a senior architect. I've been in the field for about 21 years now. I'm heavily into Active Directory, Exchange. I've done some .NET and Java development. It seems like I've tried to get out of the Active Directory space and Exchange space, and I just keep on coming back. It's so neatly tied to identities, so I can't get out of the space. I've been working with identity and access management platforms and IGA platforms for about 14 years now. I used to do Computer Associates Identity and Access Management product, MIM, Savient, and software IDM. I have 9 years working with Azure Hybrid Identity, starting with doing migrations to Office 365 Exchange Online. I specialize in merger and acquisitions with a focus on identity. I've done a lot of Active Directory migrations from large organizations, health companies, and hospitals, and I've done some migrations for some grocery food chains also. So what is our agenda today? We're going to go over what is hybrid identity. This discussion here will be heavily into the Azure and Microsoft space for directories. So we're going to talk about what is Azure AD, what is Azure AD Domain Services, what are the differences between these two cloud directories, why do you need hybrid directories, go over a couple scenarios there, and then a path forward. So what is hybrid identity? It's part of identity lifecycle management, which replicates profiles, identities being profiles, across disparate directories that can be used for authentication and authorization. Same user, different directories. The disparate directories serve different purposes in an organization. Authentication to cloud, another directory that would be for on-premise, and then those directories provide different authentication types. One would be like Windows integrated authentication, and maybe the other one does SAML authentication. I hope everyone is familiar with Azure Active Directory. I'm assuming everyone probably uses Office 365, so you probably have Azure AD that you're using for authentication to your different Office 365 services. While some people might be a little bit more mature using Azure Active Directory, maybe using governance, using your Active Directory, Azure Active Directory for authentication to your SaaS applications. So I hope everybody's familiar with Azure AD so far. So Azure Active Directory is a cloud-based identity and access management service. It can provide governance for your different SaaS applications or roles, entitlements, and your identities. I say entitlements. Entitlements are kind of a fancy way of saying, your security groups for app, so your applications have so your account has access to your different, different applications based upon a security group or an entitlement. Azure Active Directory has provides the authentication types as single sign-on to your portal using ADFS, which is SAML, and other authentication types like OAuth and WS. So what is Azure Active Directory Domain Services? So Azure AD Domain Services is a cloud-based directory in Azure. It provides managed domain services with a subset of fully compatible traditional Active Directory domain service features such as domain join, OUs, group policy, and LDAP. I say managed domain. You might hear me say that throughout this presentation. If I say managed, that means I'm talking about the Azure Active Directory domain services. And the managed domain is similar, almost identical to what you have if you have an Active Directory domain service on-premise. Works pretty much the same way. And it has authentication features such as Kerberos and NTLM. So it's almost like you have your directory in the cloud. So what are the differences? So Azure AD, we can have that standalone. If you don't want to have anything from on-premise syncing to the cloud, if you just are cloud only, you can use that as your authentication, or you can synchronize through Azure AD Connect. There is no way to do an LDAP bind to your Azure AD. You can use PowerShell scripts to look at the users and Graph API, but there's not like an LDAP bind tool that you can use. They are Azure join machines for Azure AD, and you can use it as single sign-on to different apps inside of Azure or third-party applications. Azure AD Domain Services integrates with Azure AD, which itself can synchronize with an on-premise Active Directory domain service environment. So if you have Azure AD Connect, it would synchronize to Azure AD. And then when you turn on Azure AD Domain Services, that would synchronize your Azure AD to your domain services. So this gives you the ability to extend your central identity use cases to different applications that run in Azure as part of a lift and shift strategy. I'll discuss this kind of the lift and shift strategy a little bit later. In Azure AD Domain Services, we can do an LDAP bind for applications. So you can use an LDP.exe tool to connect to your domain services. You can use Active Directory users and computers, GPO for GPO policies, and they are domain join machines. They're not Azure join machines, and they are not hybrid join machines with Azure AD domain services. Some of our differences that are continued. So Azure AD joined is really good for end user mobility and desktop services, and Azure AD domain services is good for server VMs deployed in Azure. So Azure AD devices are controlled by Azure AD. Directory services, Azure AD DS manages those machines. Azure AD is representation in the directory as just, it's a device. And Azure AD is a computer object, just like on-premise. It's a computer object that shows up as a computer object also. The different authentication types, we talked about those before: OAuth, SAML for Azure AD, and Kerberos and TLM. Now, to manage your different devices, you can use Intune or any third-party MDM solution for your Azure AD join machines. And then for domain services, you can use group policy. Azure AD join networking, it works over the internet. For domain services, you must be connected to that network. So your Azure AD or your Azure virtual networks would be a way to connect to that domain services. ExpressRoute would be another way that we could connect to domain services. So the hybrid directory architecture. So what does this look like in Azure? So when you turn on Active Directory domain services, it'll spin up 2 domain controllers in the background that you do not have to manage. Any upgrades, any any hardware infrastructure, that's all managed by Microsoft. So you would not have to worry about doing upgrades or updates to any of those domain controllers. Those domain controllers, would be resources inside of your Azure AD in your Azure in the Azure portal. There's different types of licensing for Azure domain services. They range from if you have like a standard package using like user accounts, about 15 cents an hour, and that ranges from your object count being 0 to 25,000, backup every 5 days. And then we can have different enterprise and premium services that Microsoft provides, which do larger groups of objects from 25 to 100, and then 100 to 500,000. And those prices change based upon the amount of users or objects that are in your domain controllers. So the actual architecture, we have your managed domain, which is in a virtual network in Azure. You have your Azure AD tenant, you have your Azure Active Directory accounts, and then you use Azure AD Connect, which can bring accounts on from your on-premise. If we're looking at the diagram to our right, Azure AD DS, the synchronization process is one way as it goes from Azure Active Directory to the domain services. There's no reverse synchronization back to Azure AD. It is a managed domain, largely read-only. You can do custom organizational units. You can create user accounts inside of the managed domain. But if you're, what we're trying to do here is, we're trying to use the domain services. If we're using as a kind of a user domain, we probably want to synchronize our accounts from Azure Active Directory. But there could be accounts that we might want to create inside of that domain. You can't make changes to the user attributes or the passwords, and you can't change group membership inside of the directory. So all that stuff is managed outside through Azure AD. What else is not synchronized? So any attributes from on-premise Active Directory domain services. So if you have extended your schema, or you have added different attributes, those don't automatically sync to the cloud. If you have filtered them out of Azure AD Connect, they won't sync to Azure AD domain services. Group policies are not that you've configured on-prem are not transferred over either. That would be something you'd have to create net new. Sysvol folder, same thing. It is not, there's not a way to migrate that over. Computer objects for computer joined to an on-premise AD domain environment are not migrated over. Those objects are filtered out. SID history attributes for users and groups are not migrated to Azure AD and then to domain services. and I'm going to go through this real quick and then probably discuss it a little bit later also about SID history, is the object SID that is in your current on-premise Active Directory domain. That object SID is what is placed in the SID history attribute in Active Directory, in Azure Active Directory domain services. So the object SID does get created and does get synced to Azure AD, and it is put in the SID history attribute for authentication for legacy apps. Organizational units are also not migrated up, but you can create your own organizational units inside of Azure AD domain services. So why choose a kind of a hybrid approach? Scenarios that still require access to on-premise resources. So any applications that use NTLM or integrated Windows authentication might be a way that, hey, we have, these apps, we can't migrate them to the cloud. So we might, use your on-premise directory and then Azure AD for Office 365. Also, why a hybrid approach? On-premise infrastructure cost and maintenance might be getting high. So start using Azure AD and then maybe domain services, start putting some of your resources and user accounts in domain services and migrating apps to the cloud. So, you have multiple directories, but just like before, we're having central identities. The hybrid approach is that those profiles are in multiple directories, but they are the same. And that we can use SID history, we can use password synchronization, password hash, so we can have kind of a single sign-on experience, or use the same password for different directories, or same password, but we can authenticate using the same password. And a hybrid approach for mergers and acquisitions. I'm going to give a scenario where we would want to use a hybrid approach, not only for your on-premise directories in your tenant, but from a acquired company that has Active Directory on-prem, that we can pull those accounts directly into to Azure AD and domain services. So it kind of gives us a way to leverage domain services and kind of get away from the old school migration approach. So kind of a path forward with hybrid. As explained before, mergers and acquisitions, with one managed domain, we can manage multiple on-premise domains. So we can have two on-premise domains, different domains that we can migrate to or synchronize to Azure AD and synchronize those to Azure Active Directory domain services. It would be a flat structure. So when we're doing, let's say, a merger and acquisition, if we had the ability using Azure AD Cloud Connect, we can connect to an on-premise directory that is let's say we have acquired, and synchronize those accounts into Azure AD and synchronize those into domain services. So we can kind of skip if we have to, where we're, let's say it's a small acquisition where we don't need all those accounts on-prem. We're trying to move to the cloud with our identity solution. That's where we can take those identities, move them right to Azure AD and to domain services, use integrated authentication for our applications, and get away from using what's on-prem and not maybe have to migrate the on-premise application from our acquisition to our current domain structure. So we're not doing multiple migrations. And we're just using one Azure AD tenant and one domain service. Also, when objects, I think I explained this before, app access, object set is stored in the SID history for access to resources migrated to Azure AD. So when we are using integrated Windows authentication and we have an application that is on-prem and we migrate that application to the domain services inside of Azure, we don't have to reackle that server, or we don't have to reackle that application, because it already has the SID in the SID history for that authentication. That is not to say that if you had like a SQL backend that did the authentication, that that would handle that scenario. It would be when you're using Windows integrated authentication for your application. I have in here SP for SharePoint. We can migrate SharePoint to directory services also. Microsoft has provided a specific organizational unit and some Kerberos constrained delegation service accounts that allow for profile synchronization inside of the Azure domain services to sync to SharePoint, so you can start migrating SharePoint on-prem to the cloud or to domain services in Azure. Also, resources from on-premise can gain access to Azure AD domain services, like file access from on-premise to resources like file share on your Azure AD domain service machine. So we could have, I could log into a Azure AD domain services machine and then get file access to either something that's on that machine or something that's back to on-prem. So we can set up a one-way outbound forest trust to your on-premise Active Directory domain services. So Azure AD domain service forest is trusting your trusted on-prem ADDS. So how do we secure the different directories? For Azure AD, we can use PIM/PAM for managing the directory. So we have different roles for PIM and PAM: global admin, directory writer. So that's how we could put users in those groups so they have the ability to manage Active Directory. And then with PIM and PAM, we can do if they have to have multi-factor authentication. And then if we want to, for Azure AD, we can do conditional access, where we're having only people from on-prem network can manage Azure AD. It has to be from a domain join machine, must use multi-factor authentication. And then for also, we can do access certification for the different roles inside of Azure AD. So for global admin, directory writer, or any role that was created, we can do governance on that. So we can certify that someone needs access to actually manage Azure AD. Since Azure AD domain services is similar to domain services that you have on-prem, one of the differences, there is no admin or enterprise admin. So there wouldn't be an ability for someone to take over your admin or enterprise admin account and get access to that. You can create as a resource access via Azure Network. So you have to be in Azure, you have to be in the network to actually get access to that domain service. On-premise domain does not trust Azure AD domain service domain. You can create password policies and lockout policies for domain services, just like you do for on-prem. So you could use the advanced policies to lock down domain services. You can enable or disable Kerberos. You can also do constrained delegation, so we can limit scope to the different applications or resources in your directory services. And we can set up RDP with MFA inside of your network using a network policy server to get access to the different servers inside of so if we have servers that are domain joined to your Azure AD domain services domain, we can set up RDP with MFA. So when you RDP, you can do MFA on those servers. So one other way that we can kind of modernize authentication, this is a way that we can use app proxy. So knowing that domain services uses NTLM and Kerberos, what we can do is, if we have our Azure Active Directory managed domain and we move integrated Windows applications into that network, we can put a app proxy in front of that. So we can use Azure AD, use modern authentication. So we can do MFA, conditional access to that, for the user account to that application. And then we can use Kerberos, constrained delegation, to authenticate our users to that legacy application. So not only is the application still using legacy authentication, we are using modern auth just to get in. So we kind of, with that directory or that network strategy, we provide the modern auth. That is all I have. I just want to say thank you. Is there any questions? You can type any questions that you have over to the right, and I'll be able to answer them. And I just want to say thank you for your time. If you want to reach out, you can put into info@oxfordcomputergroup.com or Twitter, LinkedIn, or Facebook. I'm just going to hold on to the line. You can type out any questions you have, and I'll more than happily go over that.
Hey, Nathan, it looks like you have a question.
As of right now, there's no way to extend the schema. It's not a pure replacement, but it can be, so it would be kind of a hybrid approach where if you have applications that are Windows integrated, using Windows integrated authentication, you can migrate those applications, those servers to your Azure infrastructure services. We would be able to use that managed domain for authentication. I'm not here to say that's going to 100% replace what you have on-prem from a domain perspective, but it would help, start migrating your domain services and your applications to the cloud. So we'll be able to do some applications, some of your domain, but not everything. It can be used for, mergers, acquisitions, to not migrate anything to on-prem and try to migrate everything to the cloud, and not have user accounts across all your different domains.
I think we're good with questions, Nathan.
Do what?
I think we're good with questions.
Okay. I just want to thank everybody for their time. If you have any further questions, please reach out to us. We'll be more than happy to help.